Oh, I'm on mute. It would help if I unmuted myself, wouldn't it? Hello, everyone. Welcome to our last conversation around our IDA Award Spotlight series. We're really excited for this panel this evening. Before we get started, we're just going to do a few housekeeping things. And first of all, we'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. I come to you today from Los Angeles, which is on the occupied land of the Tongva and the Chumash people, who have been stewards of this land for generations. We'd like to acknowledge the indigenous people on whose land we stand on today. And just a few things, the chat has been turned off and we will not be doing an audience Q&A for this. So you're just in for a treat with a great moderated conversation. This is being recorded and will be put up on our YouTube hopefully later this week or the beginning of next week. And that's it for me. So I'm gonna get this started. So I'm gonna introduce our moderator, Fisher Stevens, who is also the executive producer on Tiger King. Welcome, Fisher.
Thank you. Thank you, Cassidy. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the new world of Zoom and documentary and filmmaking. It's very surreal. I'm in Long Island, New York, in a room and trying to find space to be alone, as there's few people here and 2 children in the other room. So this is the new reality. Thank you for joining us. I would like to bring on Chris Smith, Rebecca Chaiklin, and Eric Goode, who Rebecca Chaiklin and Eric Goode co-directed Tiger King and co-produced. Chris Smith executive produced Tiger King and was one of the innovators behind putting the whole thing together. So can we get them on the screen? Hello, Chris.
Just press accept, guys.
Is it me who has to do it, or they do it, right?
They do it, yeah.
Rebecca, okay. And then Eric is
magically appears.
Yes, and then okay. So Eric is somewhere in the Ethernet, but okay. Is Eric coming in?
Yeah, he is. Eric, just go to the 3 buttons, upper right hand corner, and hit start video.
Yeah, it's a good thing that we made Tiger King pre-COVID, is all I can say. It'd been a very different movie.
Chris, you're here.
I am. I made it.
And I was going to start with Eric, but I don't know if Eric seems to have not been able to figure out how to get on this thing. Okay. Eric, can somebody help him? No. Okay.
I sent him a request. He just has to hit OK. I sent him a request to start video. So you just need to hit OK, Eric.
Well, anyway, IDA people, thank you, participants, for coming. As you can see, like I said before, it was much easier to make Tiger King pre-COVID, because now we have to deal with Zooms and computers and all these things. But I will just start by saying that I met Eric when I was Eric Goode when I was 19 years old, and I ventured into a club called Area, which was an incredible nightclub in New York, and it kind of blew my mind. It blew everybody's mind who went there. Eric was one of the innovators behind it, the creator of Area, with a few other people, but partially Eric's vision. And there were incredible people and animals, and it was an amazing place. And we stayed friends for many years. And after doing The Cove, which I produced, Eric contacted me. Oh, here he is. Good, he's back. Eric contacted me and asked me to be involved a little bit with him in the Turtle Conservancy, which was a passion of Eric's in terms of saving turtles. And Eric, I think I'd kind of like to basically start this whole thing off by talking to you, and maybe you should share a little bit about your other life. Eric, beside being a hotelier and owning the partial, being one of the partners in the Bowery Hotel and the Maritime Hotel and all these New York incredible places, Eric had a whole other life that many people didn't know about, but I was fortunate enough to learn about, which was his obsession for saving rare and endangered species of tortoises and turtles. So Eric, why don't you just basically take us into that, and then that'll get us going into how this Tiger King came about.
Fisher, that's quite an intro. I come off as the ultimate dilettante, but no, I've always had a love affair and interest with exotic animals since I was a child. And, I think I suffer from latent adolescence, and I never shed that. I've always been interested in it, and especially reptiles. But I think it was at your 50th birthday party, Fisher, where I reconnected with Rebecca and told her about just the work that I was doing around the world and documenting in a very unprofessional way, stuff that I would, just my travels, whether I went to Madagascar or Indonesia or South America, I would sort of film. And I mentioned to Rebecca, hey, maybe we should do this in a more professional way. And we cast a wide net and filmed sort of all of these subcultures. And in a way, we were sort of ethnographers, or, people that really just was documenting these worlds. And we, we'd get personal with these people. And it's kind of what I did even in my earlier life, when I would bring people together in environments, whether it was a club or a hotel. It was always about bringing people together and a fascination with subcultures. So combining the world, the natural world, with these subcultures, which ultimately we did, was really interesting and an incredibly fertile landscape. There were so many different unique subcultures when it comes to, and I don't say that in a disparaging way, just unique, I guess, cultures when it comes to different interests in exotic animals, whether it's people that eat exotic animals or keep exotic animals or hunt exotic animals. And ultimately, over time, filming all of that and casting this wide net, we ended up focusing not on one specific, we ended up focusing on one specific subculture, which of course was the big cat subculture in the United States. And I remember meeting with you, Fisher, even earlier about this topic. And your concern was that it was very dangerous. And you said, Eric, how are you going to film smugglers and people that are involved in this world and not get killed? And I don't know where our conversation went from there, but that even preceded the dinner where I reconnected with Rebecca after all these years. If you remember.
Yeah, no, I remember. And true, you turned me on to this book called The Lizard King, and it was originally delving into that world, and it seemed like a dangerous proposition. And I think part of the thing was that you had made many different connections in different types of these worlds, and you wanted to document them. And then Rebecca, I've also had done 2 films with Rebecca, and Rebecca seemed to be the perfect conduit to help you kind of capture all this stuff. And then you guys got together, and it started to come together, but it wasn't still, you hadn't discovered the big cat world at that moment yet. It started out being more reptiles, which is the world that you knew. And then you guys discovered the big cat world. And, why don't you talk a little bit about, and Rebecca, you can chime in, but when you guys did kind of finally make that left turn to the big cat world and kind of focus on that once you met Joe and once you met Carol, and how that all came about.
Do you want me to answer that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, it was somewhat serendipitous that one day when we were filming a notorious reptile guy, a guy that I'd known for 30 plus years, another guy came to his place and happened to have just purchased a snow leopard. And I was shocked that you could just buy a snow leopard in Florida. And, sort of the rest is history. We then wanted to know, what is up with owning big cats in America. For me, seeing that snow leopard was like seeing a panda bear in someone's van. Incredibly rare, incredibly elusive. a species that lives, generally over 12,000 feet in the Himalayas in very cool, clear climates, and a very, cryptic species. And I thought, wow, this guy can just buy a snow leopard. So that set us on this journey to really look into the world of big cat ownership in America. And, we were equally, I should say this from the outset, we were equally interested in what was going on with these animals as we were the people behind it. And I would say they were somewhat parallel. We were also interested in telling a story that was maybe somewhat unorthodox. And you, Fisher, and I have talked about this in the past, that people don't have the stomach or tolerance to watch animals suffer or being bludgeoned to death. You, of course, being involved in the Cove. And we really wanted to do a film and chronicle this world in a way that didn't feel like an advocacy film or a film that was preachy or using the voice of God or heavy narration. And so we really felt it was important to get into that world. And of course, I had a level of access just from my history in the animal world, which allowed us to, access some of these people that were quite difficult. And I'd let Rebecca speak to that as well.
Yeah, well, Rebecca, I mean, I guess once you guys did find Joe and Carol, I mean, originally Tommy Crutchfield was kind of the in to all of this, and Tommy Crutchfield being the reptile dealer that Eric knew. And Eric had a relationship with Tommy and a relationship with a lot of these exotic animal owners and collectors. So when was it, I mean, Rebecca, you can answer this first, but when was it when you and Eric knew that you had kind of, you had a different movie that you were going to make, or a different show? Because at this point, you weren't even sure if it was a movie or a show, but why don't you talk about that?
I mean, I think we definitely felt as though it was a feature doc initially that we were, and it did take sort of a radical right turn with the big cat people, because initially Eric had told me about this wild world of exotic reptile dealers in South Florida who, it was sort of like Breaking Bad, but instead of selling meth, they were selling exotic animals and traversing the world to find the most rare, endangered species on the planet. And so then when we stumbled into this big cat world, it really took a radical shift, and it took us into this whole world of Mario Tabro and Carol Baskin, who we initially thought was somebody who was really trying to do the right thing, and Joe and Doc, and it became clear pretty quickly that there was this feud that was going on that gave it a narrative drive and connected all these very colorful characters. And it was an incredibly interesting world, and sort of an important issue in terms of what our relationship with the natural world was, and what it meant for us to keep these wild animals in cages, and the fact that there are more tigers just in the state of Texas being kept privately in people's backyards than there are left in the wild. And so it really set us on this wild journey, and the characters were incredibly colorful, and in some ways they were so colorful and so wild that at times they trumped the issues that we were really interested in exploring, because they were so colorful.
So when you did come across these characters, I mean, why don't we just start, Eric, with the fact that you also kind of have your own amazing experience with exotic animals, and how did that kind of help you get these people like Joe and Carol and Doc to open up to you and to kind of just say, okay, I'm going to tell you my story?
I mean, first I'd say there's kind of one degree of separation between a lot of these people. There's interconnectivity between, of course, Mario and Tommy Crutchfield and Mark McCarthy, and they all kind of know one another. So they're not totally independent worlds. Mario Tabraue had a long relationship with Tommy Crutchfield, so somewhat incestuous. But because, in full disclosure, I walked a thin line, a gray line, a blurry line of knowing this world quite intimately for most of my life. I was, as a teenager, as a kid, fascinated with actually being one of these people in a way, collecting animals and wanting the sacred holy grail of certain species, particularly reptiles. And so I understood these people. And, I say that not in a condescending way or in a exploitive way. I just want to be clear. But I was able to talk to these people in a very personal way. And I think what you see in the Tiger King, hopefully, is the truth and a real honesty. We shot people in their own environments. And I always love the Andy Warhol quote that you learn more about someone by seeing where they live than actually talking to someone. And I think that's really apropos. And we went into their worlds and we filmed people in their environment for the most part. And we really became very personal. We had a very personal connection with most of these people because we spoke the same language much of the time. Even though a lot of their practices weren't practices that I agreed with, I could at least speak their language, which allowed for us to get interviews that didn't feel staged or too stiff. We could talk about sex and drugs and exotic animals and the whole ball of wax. And so we got very intimate with these characters, And I don't want to put myself above them or below them. But that was, I think, one of the successful aspects of this series.
Yeah, I feel like you really captured them without judging them in any way. It was one of the great things about watching the footage when you guys would bring it back. It was like you let them tell their story. You let them basically tell the audience who they were without you guys kind of putting a judgment on them.
And can I say one other thing about that? I would just say that obviously access is everything. And shooting this, we had to be incredibly nimble because there were times when we went to a location and knocked on a door and no one answered for an hour. And suddenly we had to recalibrate. And there were times when we had to, I didn't know from one day to the next if I would be in Texas or have to be in Florida the next day. And so the filming process, because it was that kind of documentary, contemporaneous, not something from the past, not something set up oftentimes, we had no idea if we'd be able to film someone or not. And Rebecca knows that clearly. We would call Saf all morning and Saf disappeared, poof. And suddenly we had to redirect what we were doing. And so the fluidity of it was really tricky. And we were playing many roles, private investigators sometimes, filmmakers sometimes. We wore a lot of hats.
And what did they, and this is to both of you, what either one of you, Rebecca or Eric, but what did they feel that you were making? Like, what did Joe ultimately think because, he just started, I watched both of you just completely make Joe trust you both more and more. And he just started just completely opening up to you. He talked at first, he was more superficial with you. And then as you guys got deeper, he just really, you saw Joe a different, like the onion was peeling, even though he's always performing. What did he think you were doing? And then I want to ask you the same thing about Doc and Carol, but what was the idea that you told him originally? Did he expect this was going to be a series, or what did he think?
Well, when we first started shooting with Joe, we thought it was going to be a documentary, and he was a dream character because he wanted so desperately to be on camera. And he was this incredibly open book. So he would share any and everything. He just loved being on camera in a way that I think very few people do. It was like, his dream come true when we showed up, rolled in with a couple cameras and a whole crew. And so he was super easy. And Carol was on a mission to get out she had this mission that she was on, and she thought that this was a great platform for her. And when we were just filming their lives, and Doc was much more cagey and difficult to access, and Eric's background in that world was super helpful in terms of getting us access to him. But Joe he was really an open book. He still is. He wears his heart on his sleeve. He doesn't hide anything. And so, and he was obsessed with filming himself. So he had this incredibly rich archive. So he was really an incredible character to stumble across. And, you know, being this like flamboyantly gay man living in rural Oklahoma with over 200 tigers, it was quite something to stumble upon him.
But I would say to that point, Fisher, there were people that were very difficult to earn their trust. You know, Mario Tabraue, Doc Antle, even, you know, certainly Jeff Lowe, Tim Stark, and for very real reasons. You know, this world, you know, is, you know, they're faced with really sort of an existential crisis, which is, should people keep these animals in captivity? And they know that, you know, animal welfare groups, animal rights groups, the government, the feds are looking at them, and they were very guarded. You know, Carol and Joe were the exceptions in this story, who, against maybe their better judgment, were not guarded, but it's a very guarded, shrouded, secretive world. You know, and yeah, so I don't want to underestimate, well, it was challenging, and I think it's very important for people to know that it wasn't easy to access some of these people, and we did have to earn their trust.
Yeah, for sure. So when, in terms of, let's just talk about the genesis of going from a feature to a series, and then I'll bring Chris in and we'll start talking about putting it all together. But talk about that decision-making and when you guys realized that this isn't a feature. Because originally, I mean, you guys would always tell me that it was a feature, and then you had your, you know, you guys, Rebecca and Eric, kind of shifted into the series idea. And when did you think that? When did you realize that? And was it when the whole twist of the movie happened, so to speak, or the series happened, or how did you decide that you were going to make it a episodic?
Rebecca, do you want to answer that?
I mean, I have to give this credit to Eric, because I was like, this is going to be the greatest feature doc ever. And Eric kept saying, but there's too much. We have to turn it into a series. And I was very reticent because I had never done a series, and it felt very daunting. But, you know, it was a story that was continuously unfolding. I mean, Eric was filming literally the day that we locked picture. So it did become, at a certain point when Joe became sort of a national story, at that point it sort of settled in that it was probably more than just a feature doc. And then it became really this daunting idea of like, well, how do we structure this? And there's so many different, we'd filmed so much at that juncture, and there were so many different directions we could go in. And that's when you and Chris came on board, and it was incredibly helpful to have somebody like Chris, who is so hands-on and had this experience in terms of how you begin to lay this out, and you are able to take these dips into people's worlds, but you have this driving narrative that takes you through 6-7 episodes, and the story continued to unfold, and it became bigger and broader than I guess I had personally ever expected. But Eric was definitely the first one on the tip of like, I think it's more than a feature doc. And I really held back, you know, like was very resistant to the idea of making that shift.
I would just say, Fisher, and I'd like Chris to speak, but I'd just say, just on that evolution, a lot of people ask, you know, what did you set out to do? What did you tell your subjects? You know, what were you doing? And the truth is, because this was a contemporaneous story that unfolded in front of us, you know, we would, you know, in a million years never have said to anyone this would have ever, you know, swung into the true crime genre for 1 second. We were filming people because we thought it was a really interesting world, this relationship between people and really interesting people and animals, and exotic animals in particular. And, you know, the truth is that we really ultimately just followed the story. And as it was sort of the onion kept unpeeling, as we followed the story, more characters sprouted out. Some fell by the wayside, but Doc Antle and Mario and Tim Stark and Jeff Lowe, and, you know, it just expanded. And then, of course, things happened that we never would have predicted, of course. And so where we landed with Joe in prison trying to, you know, allegedly hire a hitman to kill Carol Baskin, we would have never have predicted that. And so some people, there's been some level of criticism. What did you tell your subjects? Were you honest? And we were absolutely honest, but of course we had to sort of follow where the story took us. You know, so it definitely deviated from where we started. And Chris, we should let Chris speak because he was instrumental, as you know, in bringing all of this together.
Yeah, the story obviously took huge turns. So basically, I stepped away to do this other movie about tigers that was a completely different movie in Hindi and Russian called Tigerland, and Rebecca and Eric said, like, look, we have something. This has turned out incredible, and they had told me at this point, from the movie standpoint, it's no longer a feature, it's a series. And would I like to get involved? And do I, you know, what do I think? And I had, you know, I hadn't worked with Chris Smith, but I had seen Jim and Andy, and it blew my mind. And Chris and I had known each other, but we hadn't really worked together, and we'd been figuring out what to do together. And when Rebecca showed me and Eric showed me what they had, I just said, this should be, you know, Chris Smith could be the perfect guy to kind of help you guys guide this into a series format. And I showed it to Chris, and he was immediately obviously taken with the material. Who wouldn't be? And we brought it to Netflix together, but we didn't sell it right away, but we showed it to them. And then Chris, Rebecca, and Eric really started kind of digging in to kind of break down what the episodics, what the series would look like, even though Eric and Rebecca said, okay, here are the characters. This would be the first episode. This would be, and then Chris kind of stepped in and helped kind of shape it with them. So Chris, why don't you just talk a little bit about your first impressions of the material that you saw, and the process of kind of coming in. I mean, you know, you were the new kind of person. I'd known Eric since I was a kid, and Rebecca and I had done 2 movies together. And then you come into this world. You just done the Fire Festival doc with Netflix, and you just did the series with Netflix about the missing girl in Portugal. Forgot her name, but
Madeleine McCain.
Yeah, Madeleine McCain. And so, Chris, talk a little bit about your first encounters and your first impressions of coming into this project.
Yeah, my first impression was being with you, Fisher. You asked me, I think you called. You were staying at a hotel in LA, and you were like, "You've got to come over and see this thing now." Is what I remember you telling me. And I think I dropped everything, just came over because it seemed pressing. That was on a Thursday, and then Rebecca and Eric had already, you know, I felt very lucky just to be brought into the world, because it was one of those things that you couldn't believe that a subculture this formed, and that it hadn't been on my radar. Like, I feel like there's this like material that everyone's kind of aware of, and like I hadn't been following the story, and it seems so obvious, like right when you saw it, just how much there was in terms of it, like ticked almost every box of things that I'm interested in, you know. And so Fisher and I kind of strategized on, you know, what a good approach would be in terms of like, and we took it to I had just gotten off doing the 8-part series in Fire with Netflix, and so we showed it to them, the sizzle that Rebecca and Eric had, and they had the same reaction, but their reaction was also the same as mine. It's like, well, what is it? Right. And Eric and Rebecca were saying that this was a series, and I feel like every time I meet somebody with a documentary idea, they're like, this is a series, and I feel like often that the material isn't really there to support it, and it wasn't clear at the beginning to an outsider just how how far this thing sprawled in so many different directions. And Eric definitively was saying, no, trust me, trust me, trust me. And my standard reaction is just that I don't trust people, because it just, these things, when they usually get into them, they reduce. Like, everybody thinks that they have this great, amazing story, but when you actually like start getting into it, it's much, it just sort of condenses in a way that's usually helpful for the material. Like Fire, we actually cut as a 4-part series and as a feature at the same time. Pepe, one of the editors on a co-editor on Tiger King, was cutting the series version while Nick, Dan, and John were cutting the feature version. And in the end, we chose that the feature was a stronger presentation of the material. So I was very skeptical, even though over Eric and Rebecca sort of protesting that there was more there. And then it really took about 3 months for us to really get in and try to create, just understand the material, or for me to catch up and understand it. And once I actually got an understanding of the breadth of what was there, it became very apparent. And even at that point, Eric was like, I think it's more than 6, which I was highly skeptical of. And in the end, as we started getting towards the end, it did open up into another episode and ended up being 7. So I was like, I definitely didn't have the vision in that way of the bigger picture, but I think that was something that came with their 5 years of experience of living in the world and seeing firsthand of being on the ground. Because I didn't have the benefit of being on set and collecting the material and shooting things. And so I think it was, I think there was hundreds, if not over 1,000 hours of material between Joe's stuff and the stuff that they had collected. So anyways, all I can say is like it felt very lucky and fortunate to just have been brought into the world and sort of been able to go on the ride with them in terms of, such colorful world and, and such an engaging story with characters, that, I mean, the fact that they all overlapped and connected and anyways, yeah.
Well, I think another amazing thing that happened was that Chris kind of had his world of editors, and Rebecca and I kind of had our world of editors that we'd worked with. And then we kind of all brought these worlds of editors together. And the editing team, under the direction of Rebecca and Chris and Eric, were incredible. And we had like the rooms were going and I think it was just a beautiful thing to watch, because I was also editing a different project, but I got to watch how everybody worked. And it was a beautiful process watching these editors get it so together and working as a unit, the editing team, because at one point there were 6 or 7 editors on it at once, and from really amazing group of people, completely passionate. And then Rebecca and Eric and Chris were still shooting up until literally like 2 weeks before quarantine, when the picture had to be delivered, they were still shooting. So it was an amazing thing to see and to watch the way that you guys organized the team of editors and structured the episodes. And it was it really was an incredible thing to watch. In terms of the 7th episode, because talk about like Netflix also, Netflix originally, it was going to be 6 episodes, but then talk a little bit, I don't know, Rebecca or Chris or Eric, either one of you, but what was the decision making in like the extra episode, and was there going to be at one point maybe even 8? I mean, talk a little bit about how that process worked, because Netflix is very clear they don't want to go too many episodes if they don't have to, and it's rare that there's 7 episodes. This was 7, which is weird. But why don't you guys talk a little bit about that process? I don't care.
What?
Eric can take that one.
Eric, go ahead, Eric. So
I would echo what Chris said a minute ago, that I too would be skeptical. It's a little like when someone comes to me and says, hey, Eric, I have this great restaurant idea. I'm going to do a franchise of 50 restaurants. And I always say to them, no, just do one good restaurant. And it's the same with film. Just do one good film. People come to you and say, oh, I got this great idea for a series. It's so much. I will say in this case, we never looked at stretching this or trying to make more episodes intentionally. And it just, you know, and I'll let these guys speak to it. And I have the same level of skepticism that Chris shares about whenever anyone does that out of the gate. You know, I have multiple, it's you know, multiple, it's a series, multiple episodes, multiple seasons. Just hold on a minute. But in this case, we really did have an incredible amount of content, and it was thousands of hours of footage, not hundreds of hours of footage. And as you guys know, what made it so challenging in terms of predicting how many episodes we had was the contemporaneous nature of this story that was unfolding, and even beyond our lock date with Netflix. And I'll let others speak to that.
Yeah, thank God there was a lock date, because we just got the lock date before quarantine, which obviously one of the reasons so many people watched Tiger King, beside the fact that it was cool and what it was wonderful, but the quarantine made it, and we just got in under the wire. Rebecca or Chris, you guys should talk about that. Just the race to finishing.
It was intense. I mean, I think Chris and I spent far more many waking hours together than sleeping. But no, it was really, really challenging to try and finish 7 films at the same time. And, you know, locking them, and things were changing. And at that point, Chris and I were in the edit, and Eric was the only one out in the field. And he would just, every time he went out, the volume of footage that would come back and the story would change, and we were trying to adapt it. It was pretty intense, but we had an incredible, and I have to say, you know, you always want to make documentaries because they're important and because they're fun. And we had a really incredible team. Like, it was, we really bunkered down all together, and we had a lot of fun. A lot of, you know, every morning meeting where we were like reworking structure, a lot of laughs, a lot of like, it was always jaw dropping what was unfolding in this world. And
yeah, and the phone calls with Joe in jail constantly. And
exactly. It was a fun process.
And Fisher, I would just quickly add that we mentioned the editors, and Chris, you know, kudos to Chris for bringing on so many of these great editors and you guys. But I also want to just give credit to the directors of photography that were, you know, just were willing to work with us on really grueling conditions, you know, oftentimes, you know, 17, 18-hour days, and being so nimble and so patient to roll with us and be, like I said earlier, in one state one day and another state across the country another day, and to do it anyway in a way that many people would not be necessarily willing to, if I could say that.
yeah, Damian Drake, especially having the tiger in his lap and coming at him. Yeah.
Yeah, not to mention maybe getting killed on the set, exactly, on the shoot.
Everyone was. Can you talk, before we have to stop, Eric, a little bit about the impact that this movie has had on big cat laws? Has it had an impact? Has it had any effect yet?
I'll just say this, that, you know, like I said before, that we set out to tell a story and show the world something. And we didn't want to just preach to the converted. We wanted to have a large audience. So we were preaching to the unconverted, to really show people, hey, this is what's going on. And I think we accomplished that. Obviously, the pandemic helped and the timing was surreal. But, you know, I think the real answer to that question is, let's see what the statistics show. Let's see what happens in the coming months and year in respect to this issue. And I say that with a caveat that I do think there is a place for people to have animals in captive settings, you know, whether it's zoos and accredited breeding programs. And there are lots of examples of people that do good work with exotic animals, you know, Richard Branson and many people in the private sector as well. So I don't want to, you know, make a statement that says no one should be allowed to do this. And I think that, you know, your children, Fisher, and Rebecca's. We want to grow up in a place where you can see a tiger or you can see a rare bird or, and have access to that. And it's easy for me as someone privileged and with means to be able to go to Africa or Asia, but many people can't do that. And so I just want to be fair about what, where we land with this issue. I think absolutely people should not abuse and keep animals in, exploitive, terrible roadside zoos.
Well,
I think it's making more of an impact than we know, but go ahead, guys.
No, that's good. No, that's good. No, I think that we can, certainly when we, embarked on a version of this many years ago, we didn't think that it would turn into this. But in a way, the one thing is that these people are all incredibly interesting. And the one gift I think that you guys had was that they just, you A, had the access, and B, you captured the essence of who they all were. And that is what made this thing so great. And then Chris coming in at the end and being able to kind of package it all and lay it all out. And it is interesting. I'm just curious at the end of the day, if you guys have heard from any of the characters, good or bad, and, has there been any of them who want, call and say, hey, Eric, film me more, or others go, I'm so upset. I mean, has there been any of that? Have you heard from any of them?
They're all very happy.
No, but, honestly, the vast majority feel that we were, I think, honest and also portrayed them for who they are. There's a lot of people out there saying that that's not true, but the facts are, and when you speak to each and every one of them, with the exception of maybe two people that are trying to, deflect because of how they were portrayed, the vast majority of the people that we filmed, we portrayed them for who they are, and they will agree with that. And I've gone back and interviewed a lot of them, and they, said exactly that. Hey, Eric, you filmed me when I didn't have maybe my teeth, or you filmed me, this way, but that's who I was. And so, for all of the rumor mill out there that somehow the Tiger King is not a real documentary or borderline, reality TV or mockumentary, it couldn't be further from the truth. These are real people, and these were people leading real lives, and they were who they were, period.
Yeah. And in terms of the, in terms of what you wanted out of it, Eric, in terms of like getting the message out, did you feel like it happened? And Rebecca and Chris, you guys can say, the same.
I think that history will show that it's made a real impact. And I think, interestingly enough, what's really interesting about it is that we let the audience, the viewers, decide for themselves. We weren't preachy. And I think doing it that way in the end, which surprised me to a large degree, that it was as impactful as it was, I think we're going to see real change. And I believe that this will have incredible impact on how we treat animals in captivity. And I think you're going to see, one, that this story is not over and there's much more to come. As it relates to, what we call roadside zoos. And I use that phrase loosely, but these kind of exploitive zoos that are only keeping animals in captivity for monetary gain, and generally, ends up being a very selfish pursuit, which is not always the case when it comes to keeping exotic animals. But what we highlighted in this story was largely that. I'd let others speak to this.
Rebecca?
I mean, I personally don't feel as though wild animals, for the most part, belong in captivity. And so I'm thrilled that this has reached such a wide audience, and it seems to have raised a lot of awareness. And I actually think that we're in the final days of a lot of these facilities that are very cruel to the animals that live in them, and that there is a new awareness around what a healthier relationship with the natural world and wild animals. And so the fact that we could play a little part in this, and that we were able to reach audiences way beyond what an advocacy film would, I'm really pleased about that. And I'm pleased by a lot of the people who are actually on the front lines of these issues, working day in and day out, coming back to us and talking about how helpful the series has been for the work that they've been trying to do for so long.
Great. All right. Well, guys, thank you. Chris, Maestro, I call you, Chris Smith, Rebecca, Eric Goode, IDA, Cassidy, Nikki, thank you guys so much. We appreciate it. And it was a pleasure working with you, gents.
And Fisher, Chris put in, it wasn't just like the caboose on a train. He put in a year of his life plus dedicated to making this happen.
Oh yeah, I call him Maestro for a reason. Chris is the Maestro, man. He can't. He was conducting. He was conducting.
All right, we're wrapping it up.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Fisher, for steering this boat tonight. Chris, Rebecca, and Eric, it was a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cass.
Bye, guys.
Thanks.
Safe.
Bye. Have a good night.
Bye.
All right.